Hey everybody, how's it going? You may have noticed that Mr. Clinton has returned. He's not sitting on the armrest as he usually does. He's curled up right around my arm, and he has his left front paw over my wrist. He's not going to let me lift my left wrist because he wants me to continue giving him head rubs. So today I'd like to read an article from The Atlantic. It's a very interesting article about Australia and COVID restrictions, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this. It says Australia traded away too much liberty. This is from The Atlantic. How long can a democracy Clinton. No claws, boy. How long can a democracy maintain emergency restrictions and still call itself a free country? And over here you can see they have a picture of Paul Daniels. In a bid to keep the coronavirus out of the country, Australia's federal and state governments imposed draconian restrictions on its citizens. Prime Minister Scott Morrison knows that the burden is too heavy. This is not a sustainable way to live in this country, he recently declared. One prominent civil libertarian summed up the rules by lamenting, "We've never seen anything like this in our lifetimes." Up to now, one of Earth's freest societies, Australia has become a hermit continent. How long can a country maintain emergency restrictions on its citizens' lives while still calling itself a liberal democracy? Australia has been testing the limits. Before 2020, the idea of Australia all but forbidding its citizens from leaving the country, a restriction associated with communist regimes, was unthinkable. Today, it is a widely accepted policy. Australia's borders are currently closed, and international travel from Australia remains strictly controlled to help prevent the spread of COVID-19, a government website declares. International travel from Australia is only available if you are exempt or you have been granted an individual exemption. The rule is enforced despite assurances on another government website dedicated to setting forth Australia's human rights treaty obligations that the freedom to leave a country cannot be made dependent on establishing a purpose or reason for leaving. The nation's high court struck down a challenge to the country's COVID-19 restrictions. It may be accepted that the travel restrictions are harsh. It may also be accepted that they intrude upon individual rights, it ruled. But Parliament was aware of that. Until last month, Australians who are residents of foreign countries were exempt from the rule so they could return to their residence. But the government tightened the restrictions further, trapping many of them in the country too. Interstate travel within Australia is also severely restricted, and the government of South Australia, one of the country's 6 states, developed and is now testing an app as Orwellian as any in the free world to enforce its quarantine rules. This is where it starts to get really juicy. Returning travelers quarantining at home will be forced to download an app that combines facial recognition and geolocation. The state will text them at random times, and thereafter they will have 15 minutes to take a picture of their face in the location where they are supposed to be. Should they fail, the local police department will be sent to follow up in person. We don't tell them how often or when on a random basis. They have to reply within 15 minutes. Premier Stephen Marshall explains, "I think every South Australian should feel pretty proud that we are the national pilot for the home-based quarantine app." That's an interesting thing to be proud of. And you have an application that can detect your face, knows where you are, and detects your surroundings to ensure that you are where you are supposed to be right now. And if you're not, the police come to get you. Bruh. And I understand where they're coming from. I can understand where this is coming from. Australia had a very, very strict lockdown last year in certain areas, and that strict lockdown allowed them to get to a point where their COVID cases were very low, and then you had this January GameStop-looking thing over here of cases, and from what I understand, this happened because there were people that did not listen to the self-isolation and quarantine rules when they returned. So you may have had people that were in an area that had a lot of COVID, they came back to Australia, and it doesn't really take a lot of interaction before you have this happen. And I get they want to avoid this happening. The issue at this point is that this did happen. You're already at the GameStop part of the curve over here. And for me, what makes it interesting is that system essentially relies on the fact that everybody is going to follow the law 100%. It really only takes one person not following it perfectly before you get this. And essentially at that point you have two choices. Behind door number one, you accept that if there's a particular law that becomes completely ineffective if 100% of the population doesn't follow it, okay, maybe that didn't work. Or B, no, we are just going to become more and more tyrannical to ensure that everybody follows it. And for me, this particularly sends a chill up my spine, the idea that they're saying that they should be proud that they're a pilot for an application where it recognizes who you are, knows where you are, and if you don't use the app when you're supposed to, the police come after you. Dude. Other states also curtailed their citizens' liberty in the name of safety. The state of Victoria announced a curfew and suspended its parliament for key parts of the pandemic. To put this in context, federal and state parliaments sat during both world wars and the Spanish flu, and curfews have never been imposed. The scholar John Lee observed in an article for the Brookings Institution. In responding to a question about whether he had gone too far with respect to imposing a curfew, avoiding the question of why a curfew was needed when no other state had one, Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews replied, "It is not about human rights, it is about human life!" Mimicking his brother in spirit, Andrew Cuomo, who would say, "If it saves only one life." Good to see that Australia has their own Cuomo. In New South Wales, Police Minister David Elliott defended the deployment of the Australian military to enforce lockdowns, telling the BBC that some residents of the state thought that the rules didn't apply to them. In Sydney, where more than 5 million people have been in lockdown for more than 2 months, and Melbourne, the country's second biggest city, anti-lockdown protests were banned. And when dissenters gathered anyway, hundreds were arrested and fined, Reuters reported. Australia is undoubtedly a democracy, with multiple political parties, regular elections, and the peaceful transfer of power. But if a country indefinitely forbids its own citizens from leaving its borders, strands tens of thousands of its citizens abroad, puts strict rules on interstate travel, prohibits citizens from leaving home without an excuse from an official government list, and yes, that is true, reasonable excuses. Like this entire page is just, I'll leave a link down below for you to read it. It is just so freaky. Mandates masks even when people are outdoors and socially distanced, deploys the military to enforce these rules, bans protests and the arrest and fines dissenters. Is that country still a liberal democracy? Enduring rules of that sort would certainly render a country a police state. In year 2 of the pandemic, with COVID-19 now thought to be endemic, rather than a temporary emergency the nation could avoid, how much time must pass before we regard Australia as illiberal and unfree? And again, when you have lockdowns and restrictions for the first month or two, I'm not saying that I was pro-lockdown. I was always pro-vaccine, was pro-mask, pro-social distancing, pro-basic common sense shit. I was never pro-lockdown. But if you're going to have a lockdown for the first month or two, I can kind of get that. We're 18 months into this at this point. We're 18 months in. I mean, if lockdowns will continue at this point, when do they end? And at what point do you say, okay, this is not just an emergency measure anymore. This is starting to creep and seem more and more permanent and more illiberal and unfree. To give Australia's approach its due, temporary restrictions on liberty were far more defensible early in the pandemic, when many countries locked down and scientists understood little about COVID-19's attributes or trajectory. Australian leaders hoped to flatten the curve of infection in an effort to prevent overcrowded hospitals and degraded care, and the higher death rates that would follow. The country was also betting that within a time period short enough that restrictions could be sustained, scientists would develop a vaccine that protected against morbidity and mortality. As it turned out, the bet paid off. Had it behaved rationally and adequately valued liberty, a rich nation like Australia would have spent lavishly, before knowing which vaccines would turn out to be the most effective, to secure an adequate supply of many options for its people. It could afford to eat the cost of any extra doses and donate them to poorer countries. Australia then could have marshaled its military and civil society to vaccinate the nation as quickly as possible, lifted restrictions more fully than Europe and the United States did, and argued that the combination of fewer deaths and the more rapid return to normalcy made their approach a net win. Instead, Australia invested inadequately in vaccines and, once it acquired doses, was too slow to get them into arms. Of the 16 million doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine that have been released to the government by manufacturer CSL, only about 8 million have gone into the arms of Australians, the Age reported on August 21st, citing concern about blood clots and a widespread preference for the Pfizer vaccine. A further 1.6 million doses have been sent offshore to help regional neighbors such as Papua New Guinea, Fiji, and East Timor tackle COVID-19. But about 6 million doses are yet to be used, even as more than half the nation is in lockdown due to outbreaks of the highly infectious Delta variant. Australia's low infection and death rates, which the country achieved both by being surrounded by water and by adopting harsh restrictions on liberty, seemed to sap its urgency when it came time to vaccinate, even though the lack of urgency meant months more of basic human rights being abrogated. In hindsight, more urgency to get jabs in arms to end the restrictions would have saved lives, because the country would have been better protected against the unexpected Delta variant. In return for trading away their liberty, Australia's gained a huge safety dividend. COVID has killed 194 of every 100,000 Americans, 77,000 of every 100,000 Israelis, and only 4 of every 100,000 Australians. That low death rate is a tremendous upside. What remains to be seen is whether Australia can maintain that performance without permanently ending core attributes of life in a liberal democracy, including freedom of movement, peaceable assembly, and basic privacy. Now, I am very curious to see if this actually sticks. As you can see, typically the deaths trail the cases. And as you can see, we're really only starting to get to the GameStop part of the curve over the past week where you have exponential growth. And the deaths have stayed fairly low at this point. Again, you have 1 a day, 2 a day, 3 a day. Now you're finally up to 6 or 7 deaths a day. But deaths are, the cases are usually a trailing indicator of deaths. So you're going to probably see more deaths as the caseload continues to go full GameStop here. If the country quickly reinstates its citizens' pre-pandemic liberties, it can argue that the loss of liberty was only temporary, though some restrictions, such as a prohibition on leaving the country, would still seem needless if the goal was minimizing the spread of COVID-19 in the country. I agree here. I can understand telling people, listen, you can't come back in the country, or if you come back in the country, there are some restrictions, but not allowing people to leave the country. I mean, that's a tough one. Again, if you're going to have pages upon pages upon pages that say what people are allowed to and not allowed to do inside of your country, and you're only allowed to leave your house if you're doing is on a government issued list, at least give them the right to leave and go someplace where they actually do have freedom. It's one thing if you don't want people to have freedom within your nation, but to not allow them to leave your nation is pushing it a little bit. And if Australia's death rate remains lower than Israel's and America's, Australian leaders can plausibly tell their citizens that the deprivation was worth it. If not, supporters will have a much harder time defending a record that includes handcuffing a small group of teenagers after they gathered for an outdoor hangout. And again, just hearing things like this sends a chill up my spine. I live in the land of de Blasio and Cuomo, and even I did not see this type of stuff happening on a regular basis, or at all. More important than whether or not the past can be justified is what the country does from now on. Promising murmurs are coming from some politicians. New South Wales State Premier Gladys vowed to reopen the state when 70% of those 16 and older get vaccinated, Reuters reported Sunday. No matter what the case numbers are doing, double dose, 70% in New South Wales means freedom for those who are vaccinated. But in Victoria, the country's next most populous state, the news organization reports that Premier Daniel Andrews said his state's lockdown, due to end on Thursday, will be extended but will not say for how long. And this is, again, another part of the problem. When you have a list of restrictions that is as detailed as what you have on this website that I will link down below, you're going to get less buy-in from the overall community if you can't even say what it ends. And I understand. I get it. You don't know when this is going to end. You're not God. You don't know when a virus is going to stop spreading. But that doesn't mean that you can just restrict people indefinitely over it. You're going to have people who are less likely to want to follow any of this if you cannot tell them how long it's going to last. Because of its geography, Australia is a neighbor and observer of authoritarian countries as varied as China and Singapore. But its own fate, too, may turn on whether its people crave the feeling of safety and security that others from the top confer, or whether they want to be free. Yeah, one of the things that I've learned over the past year and a half is that my political priorities honestly have changed a lot from watching this. I think that compared to a lot of my viewership, I may on certain issues, on social issues, on climate change, on immigration, on a number of different things, I probably lean a little bit more liberal. But the thing that I'm noticing is that even if you put a politician in front of me where I disagree on 99% of what they say, 99% of what they do, there's this one small percent, this 1% area where there needs to be some overlap in order for me to feel that there's some base level of compatibility with the surrounding society, which is there a list of what I am and am not allowed to leave my home for on your website 18 months into a pandemic? Are you arresting or handcuffing kids that are playing outside 18 months into a pandemic? Do you have an application that I must use that takes a picture of me, that recognizes my face, recognizes where I am, where if I don't respond fast enough when you ask me to use that app, that police are sent to my location? I could disagree with a politician on a number of different things. This is one area that for me has just become non-negotiable. I need to know that not only are you not a politician that would ever do this, but that you are very, very, very far away. Like many steps are moved from ever agreeing with or being near someone who would do these things. Because just reading articles like this scares the crap out of me. And just think about it. Think about it for a moment. 2 years ago, could you ever in your wildest dreams imagine that any area of the world that would be like this outside of communist China or North Korea? Probably not. Again, and I understand where they're coming from. I really do. They're looking at this and they're thinking, a small number of people didn't follow the rules, so now we have this. But the idea that if a small number of people don't follow the rules, we are going to implement horrible policies for everybody. If you have an area with millions and millions of people, you're going to have people that don't follow the rules. You're going to have people that try to get around things. You're going to have people that do stupid shit. And I'm not for people doing stupid shit. In the beginning of this pandemic, I had a mask mandate in my store. I limited my interaction with people that I didn't know. I got vaccinated once they were available. But yeah, this is a bridge too far for me. And I think when I read my comment section and when I hear what other people say, it really does seem to be this kind of polarized thing. You're either a COVID denier or someone who is fully happy with everything that is being described in this article. But there really is that middle ground there of people that want to be responsible. They want to do the right thing. They are changing their behavior as a result of the pandemic, that just are genuinely scared and have a chill go up their spine when they think about their home being like this. It's crazy. It is absolutely crazy.